Well, Venkat, it's good to be back with you. We spoke previously about your previous book on economics, but in that conversation we touched a little on your scientific views about consciousness and got into a little about your Hindu faith. So I'd like to know a bit more about that. How do you approach faith and science in your life, and how do the two interact, and how do you reconcile any inconsistencies?
This is something which I've wondered all my life, adult life, and certainly for the last 30, 40 years I've thought about this quite a bit as to how to reconcile what you hear from the religious side and what you see as a scientist, what you learn about the world and the universe to some extent. I think Hinduism gives me a certain amount of latitude and a certain framework to address this apparent dichotomy. The scriptures, which are anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 years old, depending on who you believe in, when describing God, which is referred to as Brahman, which is a Sanskrit word in the ancient scriptures, Brahman is defined by three fundamental properties. In Sanskrit, it goes as Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat stands for truth or existence, or essentially it is the true reality. Chit stands for consciousness, and Ananda is roughly bliss. So Brahman is defined as a being which is always present, and that is the true reality, and it is infinitely conscious, and it is infinitely happy. So that is the state of bliss. So I see then this whole thing in the framework of a spectrum of consciousness going from zero to infinity, as it were. So this is where I wear my scientific hat and try to interpret what this means, perhaps scientifically. And by the way, my understanding has been evolving over the years, and I'm still, this is a work in progress, so it's not a finished product, whatever I say. And so at the one extreme you have things with zero consciousness, and that could be pure matter that's inert. And the other extreme is this being with infinite consciousness. And Hinduism kind of intimates that this is a continuous spectrum. At one extreme you have zero consciousness and matter. So there is consciousness, no consciousness, but there is matter. The other extreme, it's pure consciousness, devoid of matter. So that's again very interesting, that can consciousness exist by itself without a chassis? It's like, basically consciousness is like an engine, and the body is like, the matter is like the chassis, and then we think that consciousness can exist only in a material body, and then it cannot exist purely on its own. Now Hinduism says that's a possibility, that you could have a pure, and so then it raises a whole sort of questions which are hard to answer in current science, but perhaps down the road we might be able to. What are the laws that govern this conscious state? Now, that's a really difficult question to answer, because we don't even understand what our consciousness means. For example, we don't know how a single neuron, which is not self-aware, but when you take 100 billion of them and organize them in a particular way, which is the human brain or the mammalian brain, the whole thing is self-aware. How does that come about? So we don't understand that. So when we are in that state where we don't even understand what it means to be conscious, from a purely mechanistic point of view, drilling down to fundamentals of biology and physics and chemistry, to deny the existence of other conscious states above us, I think that's a bit premature. And so So the way I may not necessarily agree with all the details of Hinduism with respect to the rituals and so on and so forth, but I think the broad framework allows for a discussion and plurality of thoughts, and it is broadly consistent with the things which you have learned. It's fine with Darwinism, and that's a very important scientific breakthrough we've had. And then it is consistent with, broadly consistent with the age of the universe, age of the planet, and now the where it has said something which scientifically we haven't quite figured out is this infinite spectrum of consciousness, and that there are higher states that are possible. Now, scientifically, we haven't found any evidence for that, but it's too premature to say that such things are absurd. So as a practicing Hindu and a practicing scientist, I don't see a whole lot of conflicts between these two, because Hinduism allows for these kind of questions to be asked and answered, and some of the answers they've provided, they make sense, even though they said this 3,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, they still make sense today as we learn more and more about our universe and life.
Why try to make sense scientifically of these stories and ideas about an infinite consciousness? Why not just start from what we can know scientifically and then build our conclusions from there?
Right. I'm perfectly fine with that. And in fact, that's the world I live in on a daily basis. That's exactly what I do. And in fact, the problem I work on emergence, which is how do we get more complex systems and behaviors out of millions of fairly simple elements. The neuron to brain transition is one of those. So how does complexity emerge from simplicity? That is actually my scientific quest. What I'm trying to, the reason I to look into the religion to see, I'm trying to see whether there are some insights they have which might be helpful in thinking about these kind of problems. And particularly, I'm interested in the neuron to brain and mind, that emergent behavior. And since the Hindus talk about consciousness a lot, I'm trying to understand from a mechanistic point of view whether I can get some insights from there, which then I can put in a mathematical framework.
So how does symbolism in Hinduism play a role in your thought about the world and science?
Right. So symbolism plays a big role in Hinduism. And in fact, if you don't understand the symbolism, you can interpret Hinduism completely wrong and go down a path which would make absolutely no sense. And I see the Hindu symbolism very much like how we approach a problem in mathematics, for example. So, for example, in algebra, so let's say it's Halloween and you're sitting at the door with a basket full of candies. And after 3-4 hours after Halloween winds down, you look at your basket and you are left with one candy. So if I were to ask you, how many candies did you start out with? So how would we solve this problem mathematically? It's a very simple problem in algebra. You would first say, let's say I had X number of candies initially. Then I gave out 1 to the first kid, so X minus 1. Then 2 to the next one, X minus 3. Then my wife came along and added 10 more, so it's X minus 3 plus 10. It's X plus 7 now. So you'll keep track of these additions and subtractions. And then finally, you'll have an expression, and that is equal to 1. And then you solve and you figure out what X is. So think about what we have done here. You didn't know how many candies you had. You made up a number you made up a symbol X. You don't know what X is, but you treat it as if you know it. You subtract numbers from it. You add numbers to it. We can divide it. We can multiply it. And you go through this, and eventually X reveals itself. Even though you didn't know what it was, finally at the end of the journey, you found out what it was. And all along, you treated it as if you knew it, like any other number. And that's exactly what the Hindus do in our approach to God. For example, we worship in various forms in metal or stone. And when people think, they're just worshiping a stone figure or a stone statue, they're missing the point. That stone is X for us. We don't know what God is. So that's X. But we treat it as if we know him or her or it. All three are admitted in the Hindu philosophy. So you treat it as if like a real being. So you bathe it. You offer food to it. You decorate it. You talk to it, which is what the chants are. This is exactly what we do in algebra. You take an unknown quantity, but treat it as if you know it. And in this journey, eventually X reveals itself. So that is God reveals himself or herself or itself. So that's where symbolism matters a lot.
Okay. So, but with arithmetic and other forms of mathematics, we use them to describe reality very usefully. We can predict what happens.
Right.
So what does the symbolism in Hinduism give us? How does it improve or help us live better lives?
Yeah. Basically, God, for all practical purposes, is an unreachable abstract quantity or an abstract state, right? So how do you, it's an unknown quantity. So how do you deal with an unknown quantity in a realistic, in the reality, in the real world, where there's something, by all definitions, since it's infinite, it's unreachable, and it's beyond our comprehension, and that's how it's usually defined. But somehow you want to know about it, learn about it. And I see a very strong parallel between that and then how we treat an unknown quantity in mathematics. You give it a symbol, and then you treat it as if you know it. And so this basically what it helps the Hindus do is to think about this abstract form. So there is a given here that we all accept that there is an abstract form. So the question is, how do we build a relationship with it? So here is this approach. You create a small statue or whatever, and then the more realistic it looks, the more believable it is for people to relate to. So in principle, you can take a piece of rock and then that's your X and treat it like all the things I said. And that will get you there too. But it is a lot easier for people to believe in something which, when it looks like it's human personified, right? So many of the Hindu gods look like humans with extra hands. The extra hands, again, is the symbol to say that the four hands, for example, typically of Vishnu, basically, the extra hands symbolize this is a being that has capabilities beyond your ability. So, the difference between animals and humans is, for example, we have two hands, and with hands we do things. Now with four hands we can do more things, and so that is that kind of symbolism again. So it's not as if we think that there is a God with four hands. The four hands, again, is a symbolism for signaling capabilities which are beyond the human level. And so the more clues in that figure that makes you think about these things, the more believable it is for you to treat that X as a real thing. And so it is essentially, all this is to help ordinary people grasp something very distant and very abstract.
That helps me transition to what I would like to mention and throw to you.
Sure.
So recently something sad happened in my family. About a month ago, I received a message from one of my aunts who lives in Peru. My mom's side of the family is Peruvian. And she asked me to pray for someone who was really ill. And it wasn't specified who it was.
Right.
But I, responded, okay, sure, no problem. I hope everything works out.
Right.
But I didn't actually pray because I don't believe that will help.
Not
but I thought about the person. I thought about them recently because I found out who it was, but I didn't know at the time. But I said I would think about just wishing well, and I found out that it was my cousin's wife who died of cancer recently. She was battling ovarian cancer. And so I think about them, like, praying for this person to get better, and I'm really sad about it. And I wonder, like, how this religious belief that maybe something good can happen out of prayer seems to just add more complication and mystery to something that could be less painful if we just understood it naturally as something that happens to people. Instead, they're forced to think that, like, oh, maybe God wanted this to happen. Maybe for some reason God wanted to take her away. Maybe it's because it's a punishment for something that they did as a family. Maybe we didn't pray hard enough.
Right.
So just I don't know how to feel about this aspect of belief. I consider kind of superstitious.
Right.
It might be a part of religion in that way, but it might not be essential to religion.
Right.
But so I just felt morally conflicted there because I mean I'm not going to tell them, I'm not going to pray because I'm an atheist.
That's right.
So yeah, I mean I just think that it would be better for people, in my opinion, if we didn't have this confusion brought on by a belief in prayer's effectiveness in helping people. But I see that it brings people together also. It knowing that someone is praying for someone who's ill, it lets you know that someone else is also sharing your pain and your hope, and that is comforting as well. So, I mean, is there anything in Hinduism for you that you rely on for consolation, or do you have a more naturalistic view when it comes to trying to deal with hardship? And
right. Again, you've been asking excellent questions and difficult questions, Brian, and haven't really thought that much about the emotional aspect. The religion partly exists because it provides some kind of an emotional or psychological support along the lines you mentioned, and it might just be easier to leave everything to just chance, that it's just a random event. After Big Bang, things evolved, and we are here, and there's really no purpose to life. There's really no meaning to life, and life forms come and go, and there's no point in reading more into it. And so that kind of an approach perhaps will help people cope with these kind of things in some way. To me, this is now very personally that there is no meaning to life. It's very dissatisfying to me.
Yeah, I don't say that there's no meaning to life.
No. So in the sense, so I didn't mean to imply you said that, but to leave everything as a random thing, and then we are here due to random evolution, and then like the dinosaurs, something might happen and we'll all go away. I think there should be. I mean, to me, it'll be a very uninteresting prospect. It is much more interesting to think that one is part of a larger program.
There's the Darwinian program. I mean, Darwinism isn't saying it's all chance. I mean, there's a law of nature to it, right? There's something that we can discover.
True. But then whether we are here or not depends on the asteroid, and that's purely a matter of chance. And so there is a big element of chance in Darwinian program.
Of course, yeah. I also wanted to ask you about what do you think will happen when you die? Do you believe in the karmic story where successive rebirths? Does that inform how you feel about your own aging process, approaching old age?
Right. And thank you very much for reminding me of my old age. But I try not to think about it too much. But again, another great question. And And as you know, the Hindus believe in this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and at some point you are liberated, and then you break away from this cycle. And then there are some ways out of this. How do you get out of this potentially infinite cycle? So this one, I think of it a bit like a Groundhog Day kind of a thing, the Hindu view of this karmic cycle. I remember in Groundhog Day, the Bill Murray character initially, is kind of like a jerk, and then, but he's stuck on that Groundhog Day, and within a few days he realizes that he's actually stuck there. Every day is the same day. He has to relive that life, and he uses that to actually better himself. And finally, towards the end of the movie, he actually becomes a much better person. And when that happens, the day moves forward. And that's basically the Hindu view of life. We are all in Groundhog Day. And so our existence here is like the Groundhog Day. So you're given a chance to better yourself, to improve yourself. If you don't, you're born again. And you're given another chance. Essentially, you're given infinite chances. And at some point, we all get better and we break free and we reach what the Hindus call as Vaikuntham, which is roughly the equivalent of heaven. So once you go there, then the soul doesn't return back. So there is something appealing about this to me, because it's not a one shot where if I don't get it right, I end up in hell, or if I get it right, I'm released. I get infinite chances. I get many chances. So I think that is, to me, much more optimistic view.
Do you think it's accurate?
I think it's scientifically impossible to verify. And then the only way to verify this is to go to the other side and see what it is. And generally people who have gone there to the other side don't seem to come back. And even if they come back and tell us, who's going to believe them, right? So, so this will be one of those things where it's hard to prove or disprove also, by the way. So it will be Gödel-like, proposition, the undecidability theorem kind of thing, so you can decide one way or the other. So, yeah, that's the rub. I agree.
Okay. Well,
all right.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Man, that was tougher than I had imagined.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It was produced by Sinai and Synapses, and you can follow more of their work on their website and on Twitter and Facebook.